You're listening to the OCD Stories podcast, hosted by me, Stuart Ralph. The OCD Stories is a podcast dedicated to raising awareness and understanding around obsessive-compulsive symptoms. I do this through interviewing inspired therapists, psychologists, and people who have experienced OCD. Welcome to the OCD Stories. And welcome to episode 346 of the podcast. And in this one, I got back on Dr Patricia Zurita Ona. Patricia is the director of the East Bay Behaviour Therapy Centre. And I got her back on to talk about her new book, Acceptance and Commitment Skills for Perfectionism and High Achieving Behaviours. So in particular, we discuss what is perfectionistic and high achieving behaviours, fears of being a failure and not being good enough, what perfectionism can look like in relationships and friendships, harnessing the power of perfectionism without losing yourself, checking in with what matters, how these things have impacted Patricia's life, choosing to show up to what matters in your life, her new book, finding your own rhythms, value-based decisions, OCD and perfectionism, how these traits can impact exposure and response prevention therapy, and much more. And thank you to NoCD for supporting the podcast. NoCD offers effective and convenient therapy available in the US and outside the US. To find out more about NoCD, their therapy plans, if they currently take your insurance, or to download their free app, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories, or the link will be in the episode description. So thank you as always to Patricia for sharing her time. It's great to chat with her and catch up and hear about her new work. And of course, thank you to you guys for listening. It means a lot, and I hope the podcast continues to serve you. And without further ado, here is Patricia. Welcome back to the show, Patricia.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to chat with you again.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good to have you on again. I think 2020 was the last time I had you on, which surprised me that it's been that long.
It has been so long. My goodness, so much has happened since 2020 to now.
Yeah, exactly. So your new book, Acceptance and Commitment Skills for Perfectionism and High Achieving Behaviours. Subtitle is Do Things Your Way, Be Yourself, and Live a Purposeful Life. So I thought a good place to start. Actually, let's start there. What are perfectionistic, high achieving, and striving behaviours? How would you describe them?
When I think about perfectionists and high achieving behaviors and striving actions, I am thinking about these people who are prone to deeply care about what they do, and they are petrified about being a failure, about being inadequate, about not being good enough, and they are really scared of making mistakes, and they are very attached to rules about how things supposed to be, how the world's supposed to run. And they also identify themselves with their accomplishments. So behind, when you think about perfectionism, that's the label that is masking some processes: fears of being a failure, fears of not being good enough, attachment to rules, and this strong sense of being defined by our accomplishments. And one of the things that happens with perfectionists is that most people think that it's exclusive to academic settings or to career settings. But reality is that this fear of being a failure could be in every single area of our life, in how we relate to our body, how we relate to food, how I show up in my friendships, trying to be the best friend that I can possibly be, how I relate to parenting, putting a lot of pressure on myself so I can really show up to my kids, how I show up to sports, how I live my spiritual life. So I think that is something that many times people don't realize, that they may be engaging in perfectionistic actions, but because they think that it's only to career, they don't see how much they are putting pressure on themselves, or how much they are attached to these rules about how things are supposed to be and how they're supposed to perform.
Yeah, it's interesting. So where you say normally attached to like work, the word that comes to my mind is workaholic. That's maybe a term we would use in popular culture. Can you give any example? So everyone, I guess, me saying the word workaholic, most people can imagine it's someone who's doing all kinds of hours, going above and beyond, being perfectionistic in their work to the point it's keeping them late or getting them up very early or not taking a lunch break or, whatever it is. What are some examples of that in like parenting or social life or in hobbies, maybe? Are there any examples you can give to kind of illustrate what that would look like, I guess?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. Thank you for asking that. I'm thinking in particular in, let's say, relationships and friendships. How often we encounter a person that has this deep sense of value of connecting, and their friends ask him to borrow money, to drive him to the airport, to show up to dinner. And a person who is prone to deeply care and is attached to this perfect idea of being the best friend they can possibly be may keep doing all things for others, postponing their own needs. Even though they can feel very, very tired, if a friend calls them and they say, can you please drive me to the airport? They will just say, okay, let's do it. Or if a friend wants to go for dinner to a particular restaurant, but that person doesn't like the food, it still will placate and go along with that needs because it's more important to show up as the best friend. So that will be one example, and perhaps something that a lot of people don't see. In terms of hobbies, right, what we have is that a person may try to constantly, let's say, exercise like 40 times a week. Then they're going to be careful with their diet. Then they're going to be careful with in which restaurant they are eating, how much they are eating. They're going to make sure they have a particular exercising routine. Even though they are not spending time with their friends, they are not relaxing, they're not socializing, their life is organized around having this perfect workout routine. So those will be some examples besides work in which these perfectionistic actions can show up. And to your point, right, one of the things that we see is that people who are prone to be doers, go-getters, creators, they are going to be engaging quickly into these striving actions. And they're overly focused in one particular area of their life at the expense of missing connections with others or having relaxing time for themselves.
Yeah, good point, which is then going to feed into low mood and anxiety when, again, my relationships are now weakening, my friendships are weakening. I'm terrible at football now. I nearly said soccer. I'm going to use the word that we would use in our country, football, because I'm not playing it because I'm spending all my time doing this thing. And then my life's going to suffer because, I'm getting praised and rewarded maybe in that area, but all these other areas are diminishing, and that there's going to be a consequence of that eventually.
That's right. That's right. One of the things that happens is that if we think about the work that we do, when I am working with clients who are prone to high achieving behaviors, none of them come into my office saying, okay, Dr. Z, I am a perfectionist or I have perfectionistic tendencies. Mm-hmm. None of them come saying that, but they come and say, I'm having relationship problems. My partner is complaining that I'm not present enough. Or they are saying, I am working so hard and I'm not getting the results I want to have. So what happens is that there are other areas of their life that have been affected. And yes, they experience depression, sadness, loneliness, disconnection. And those are the reasons why they start unpacking a little bit their behaviors. But as you were pinpointing, the tricky part with perfectionistic actions is that it feels good to do things right and perfect. Mm-hmm. And when you deeply care about what you do, of course you want to get things right. But if you don't check how those actions are working in your life, whether they are expanding your life and building rich relationships, you are the mercy of the pressure to always to protect yourself from being a failure, to protect yourself from being inadequate.
Yeah, interesting. So a few years ago with me with the podcast, I mean, it's like nearly 7 years old now, but the first 4 years I was putting so much time in. I was working evenings, weekends, doing whatever I needed to. And I don't think I'm a perfectionist. That doesn't feel right for me. But high achieving is a label I think I can get behind. I've always, at least since the age of 18, I've been very driven. And with the podcast, I became so driven that I was ignoring other things, including like my relationship. And there was consequences because of that that luckily I caught in time and worked on, and now I have much more balance and I'm much more happier because of it, I think. But yeah, that high achieving, I got kind of blinded to everything else because I was so focused on this thing that was growing and rewarding. And
Yeah. While you're sharing that, I'm nodding my head because I am immigrant. I came to this country. I came to the States in my mid-20s, and I also start putting a lot of pressure on myself, right? In order to, this fear of not making it in a new country also, I think, was the source for me to put more pressure and trying to do things right and perfect. The one thing that I would like to clarify is that I think lately, or at least the last 20 years, we have demonized perfectionistic actions. We look at them as this evil that you have to get rid of, or we think of this, it's bad. But reality is that when people are prone to care, as you were saying, of course you care about your work with a podcast. Of course, I care about building a life in the States. It makes sense that we want to get things with some standard, with some quality, right? I like to talk more about harnessing the power of perfectionistic actions, finding the golden nuggets of those striving behaviors without losing yourself, without spending a lot of time worrying, without doing a lot of things to make sure that you don't come across as not knowing what you're doing or protecting yourself. And what I have found is that frame can be more inviting for people to check what's going on in the behaviors, because you and I, as many of the people we work with, they know sometimes when they have higher standards, people have told them, but they cannot let them go, right? If you tell a person, or just drop your standards, don't do it, right? You are being too hard on yourself, bunch of balloon. It comes through one ear and goes to the other one. But they would really tell people that it makes sense because you deeply care, that you want to do this right. You want this podcast to succeed, that you want to build a life in the States. But let's take a look, how it's really working, when good enough is good enough, and when we can let go of other things. It's a more, I think, inviting message for people to unpack their own behaviors and their own drivers behind all this doing mode.
Yeah, I like that. This idea of the drivers of why are we high achieving, or why are we perfectionistic, whatever it is. What's at the core of that? Because is there always something driving it, do you think?
I think so. I think, my take again is that when we think about perfectionism, it's just a label. It's a label that is masking or covering this strong fear of making mistakes. I'm petrified of things going wrong, but I am petrified of not being good enough, not being adequate, of coming across as not knowing what I'm doing. So we organize our behavior around that. In some way, perfectionistic actions, as they are reinforcing, but they're also protecting ourselves from being someone that we don't want to be.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, and it's, in order to unpack that, I think that requires a lot of, let's take a look, what's really driving this? Are you doing your things because of fear? Are you doing your things to prove something to yourself or to others? Are you doing something to avoid something? So those are the questions that we have to unpack a little bit when dealing with these behaviors.
Yeah, really good points. And the other thing you said earlier that I was going to ask a question around, but you've answered it, but I just want to highlight it, which is... and I'm forgetting now. I'll edit this bit.
That's what the mind does. No worries.
I know, yeah. I've been doing it a lot lately. So this idea of, when I think of someone who's a perfectionist or high achieving, and maybe more so perfectionist, of I don't want to kind of let go of this perfectionism, or I don't want to let go of the inner critic. If we think that it's the inner critic that kind of beats me up, is the thing that gets me up at 5 a.m. to train for my sport or whatever it is, tells me I'm never good enough, so I work even harder. And I'm sure a lot of professional athletes have that kind of real harsh voice. So how do you work with that, of like getting them, I guess you kind of already said it, but getting them to see that maybe you don't have to lose that, you just have to tame it a bit?
Yeah, but to your point, one of the things that I try to do in the work, which you're so familiar with, but for our audience, what we do is the academic term is a functional analysis, right? The classic functional analysis, but it's looking at what happens before you have this inner critic, the inner critic that tells you you're not good enough, how you respond to it, right? You may work extra hours. You may say, I need 1 more minute. It's not ready. You may have all types of what if scenarios. What if this happens? What if that happens? And then you look at the consequences of that. Yeah. And so that will be a first starting point, doing a functional assessment, which is looking at that. What happens before my inner critic gets activated? What does my inner critic tells me? What do I do? And how I respond to that? Right? That will be, I think, maybe the first step. But then using acceptance and commitment skills, one of the things that we know is that the inner critic is going to show up wherever we go. No matter if you are in UK, I'm in Bolivia, if we are 40, 50, 60, if we're married or single, our inner critic is going to show up wherever we go. And especially when we're doing things that matter to us. So then we practice acceptance skills to make room for that inner critic. You start noticing, okay, here comes my inner critic. Here comes my disaster forecaster. Here comes my story that I'm not good enough. And instead of trying to suppress it or trying to do things quickly, we say, okay, what really matters to me right now? Do I really, really have to listen to this inner voice? Is that going to be helpful to me in this moment or not? So that will be the second layer, right? To teach people acceptance skills, to acknowledge that the inner critic is going to be there, and then to really teach people to choose their behavior. How do I want to respond in this moment? Do I really have to go along with the inner critic? And I think many times for some people, they think that the inner critic has been motivating to them. And I may be one of them because I can be a little bit tough with myself sometimes, right? So I relate to that. But there is a difference between motivate yourself with harsh criticism versus motivating yourself with gentleness. We think sometimes that if you motivate yourself with gentleness, you are letting yourself off the hook, or you're not going to get things done with the same quality. If that's the case, we try both. We try actually 1 week really be as hard as possible with yourself, criticize yourself as much as possible, and see really how you feel about it. And the next week, see how will you look that if instead of being this harsh critical to yourself, you actually coach yourself with gentleness and with kindness, acknowledging that you're giving your best. That even though things may not be right, you're absolutely giving your best in the moment. And then people can have an experience, right? There is something about noticing what's the difference when you engage in self-criticism versus when you can coach yourself with compassion and gentleness. And then people can choose what works for them.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So you mentioned it there a bit. If you're okay to share, in what ways do perfectionistic or high-achieving behaviors show up in your life, or maybe historically have showed up?
That's a great question. I really think I deeply care about the things I do career-wise. My relationships are very important to me. Living with meaning is very important, but I think that as an immigrant that has an accent, I was scared. I was scared about not having a successful career. So I remember in grad school, I used to ask my classmates, how long did it take you to read a paper? And they would say, Patricia, 1.5 hours. And then I say, oh my goodness, that's like 5-6 hours for me. So I will book that 6 hours, right? It's over preparing. Basically, I was doing that, right? Mm-hmm. I was over preparing, over planning, over scheduling extra time because I was scared. Or if I have to give a presentation, I will be rehearsing like 2 months in advance before the presentation, right? And I will have all type of slides ready, with notes. So I think I was very scared about not having a successful career and not making it in a foreign country. And that pushed me to engage in a lot of over-preparing and over-planning behaviors. Of course, the outcome was that I was exhausted. I wasn't exercising at times. I wasn't going to salsa dancing. So a lot of things were just decreasing. And even though I was trying to have a balanced life. Reality is that I was over preparing and over planning a lot. And I was petrified with a possibility of making a mistake when talking, right? That was another fear, right? Oh my goodness, what if people doesn't understand at all what I am saying? So I think I had to learn to overcome those fears and really decrease my over-preparing behaviors, right? Like these days, I don't do that. These days, I have learned to feel comfortable if I make a mistake when talking, right? Because I have learned other things that I can communicate, even though I may not have this perfect English, I may not have the perfect sentence. That is not a reflection of how I think, right? It's just language. But so I think I had to overcome those things. And to me, that she was definitely with acceptance and commitment therapy. I don't think I knew how to make room for my fear of making mistakes, my fear of not being good enough, my fears of failing, without learning acceptance skills, without learning to sit with that and just notice the discomfort that comes with that. And then check, okay, how long am I really going to spend on reading this paper? How much time am I going to really allocate to this presentation? Those were the questions I was asking myself. And it went from 5-6 hours to maybe 1 hour, 1.5 hours. And when I made that shift, of course, I still was wrestling with uncertainty, right? How's it going to be? Am I going to make it? What if it sucks? But once you do that, I think the beauty is that you still get things done, but your life is not dominated, right? I felt that I had more space, more energy to do other things. So that was little by little. It wasn't easy, of course. It wasn't easy, but I think little by little I started noticing how it feels to not go into over preparing or over planning, which I didn't know before.
That's interesting. And then, of course, you learn, as you said there, you have more time then to be creative and a clearer head, and then you'll ultimately probably be more successful because of that. If success is the goal, that's. I think what came to my mind is as you were talking there about like changing your behavior, and then what came to mind, it's very similar to ERP and OCD. We change our behavior, we stop doing compulsions. Then our brain learns that, maybe it's okay. And here you're changing your behavior, and now your brain's learning, maybe it's okay. Maybe I won't be a massive failure. Maybe I'll survive. Maybe I'll even thrive. That's
right. That's exactly what happened. I can tell you with a lot of honesty, when I was in grad school, if someone would have told me, Patricia, you're working so hard, let go of your standards, I will have been so upset. I will have been so mad. I'm like, oh my goodness, you don't get it, right? And I think I had getting cranky when people told me those things, right? I mean, that's true. But what happens is that it reached a point in which I literally was like 5-6 hours, trying to read a paper. I was totally over preparing, over planning. And the shift came that when I start allocating small amounts of time, right? I was still, I think, getting anxious about how it will be. But then I start, I think, wrestling less. And I noticed that I had more energy. I could do other things. I was less cranky. I actually could do more in a more sustainable rhythm, right? So I had to learn by experience, basically, to your point. It was only by experience and trying something new that felt extremely uncomfortable. Then I started learning, okay, I can sit with this fear. It will be as it has to be. And interestingly, the other thing that happened is that I stopped being overly attached to the outcome. I stopped being overly attached to saying the perfect sentence in English. when I actually put that in the background of my mind and just focusing communicating to the best I could have richer and larger and longer conversations with people. So I think there is a lot that happens when you try new behaviors, right? And you let go of how things are supposed to be and you focus more, okay, this is what is happening right now. How do I want to show up right now? What matters? And you give yourself permission to let things be as they are going to be. So that was also something very, very powerful, right? That sometimes things will go great. Sometimes they may go so. But when you start giving yourself permission to live those moments as they are, amazing things happen, right? It's much more liberating. You feel more freely. And then you can do more of the fun things you want to be doing.
Absolutely. Yeah, really good point. And when you said there about if someone had said that to you when you were a grad student, you would have got angry or annoyed at them raising it. On the surface, we're like, yeah, it's funny, but if we think about it, the reason you would have got angry or annoyed, or anyone, if we confront them in this way, is you're basically telling them in the same way with OCD, you're saying stop the compulsions and just see if this horrible thing happens. In the same way with high achieving or perfectionism, it's stop being a perfectionist, but you're now telling them to look into this abyss. They don't know whether all their fears are going to come true.
That's true.
Am I not good enough? They're about to find out if they stop all these behaviors.
That's right. It's a very simplistic way, right? It's a very simplistic message to say, just stop. To me, what I would have here is stop caring. Stop caring about making your life as an immigrant. How in the world can someone tell me that, right? Like, have they smoking crack, right? How can you tell me that, right? Yeah. And to your point, also, I know deeply in my heart that when I got those messages, because I actually got them, it was so alienating to me and it didn't make sense. And it actually, what they did, they pushed me to hold on to my rules harder and harder, right? It was like, no, I'm not going to let it go. It was only when I actually, again, noticing how it was, how I was feeling tired and exhausted and cranky, that I started trying something new. So this frame that, again, I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself here, but teaching people to harness and find the golden nuggets when I push in hard and hard, I think it's much more friendly and much more inviting than simply telling them, stop caring so much, let go of your standards. Because those messages are just simplifying something that is very complex, in how we are organizing our behavior, right? So I think that that's something that hopefully is helpful for people, that they don't have to let go of their standards. They don't have to let go of deeply caring for the things they do. They just need to learn to distinguish when it's working in their favor and when it's not. And in order to do that, I think we also learn to find different seasons and to find different rhythms in our life. Sometimes you may prioritize your family relationships. Other times you give yourself permission to prioritize your career. So allowing yourself to go to rhythms is going to be much more sustainable in life than versus holding into rules about how you always have to show up to your friends in this particular way, 24/7, 12 months a year. It's impossible. It's impossible to show up to every area in our life in a perfect way or in the way that we want. So finding our rhythms and cycles, that's also very helpful.
Yeah, really good point. So many people I know are coming to mind that need to hear this. I think they'd be annoyed if I showed it to them though. Just tell us about the book. What will people find in it? Or we know what it's about now, I guess, for the first 20 minutes of this podcast. But yeah, anything you want to share on it?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. The book, I think it's really coming from this place of teaching people that they can find the golden nuggets of these high achieving and striving behaviors. That's the first part of the book. And then the second part of the book, I teach people the basics of how to play the workability game. I like to talk about the difference between playing the game of doing things right and perfect all the time to learn to play the game of doing the things that works, the workability game. And I teach people basically to unpack what's behind these perfectionistic actions. And every time they have a push to do more and more, I invite them to notice that choice point and to ask themselves, am I acting out of the fear of making mistakes? Am I doing things to protect myself from not being good enough? Am I acting based on my rules of how things are supposed to be? So to play the workability game, people start asking themselves their questions. I invite them to go back to their values and to also acknowledge that their mind is always going to come with a lot of noise, to acknowledge the dynamic nature of their mind. And then the third part of the book, it's full of micro skills to invite people to find their rhythms. For example, there is a misconception that we can be more productive in the mornings, that if you wake up in the morning and you do some writing, that's going to be your best writing. Or if you want to create something, it's the best time to do it. But there is no science supporting that. Each one of us has different rhythms, and we do have different biologies too, right? So in the book, I talk about how people have to find their way, their natural way of doing things. Some people may do it in the evening, some people in the afternoon, but there's no need to force yourself. I also teach people the skills to make decisions that they are values-based and context-based versus rule-based. Versus like, I always have to do this. It's really looking at what truly matters to you. I teach diffusion skills, the skills of noticing your thoughts for what they are instead of being consumed by them. I invite them to notice other traps, like a classic trap of high achievers is to hold into thoughts that says, when I finish this paper, then my career will be successful. Or if I eat properly and perfectly this month, then I will have this particular look. So a lot of these when, then, if, then thoughts, they need to be unpacked a little bit and really look how they work. So I teach micro skills for doing that. So there are maybe 27, 28 micro skills to really start living with more flexibility, still holding into your values, but not as rules, but in a way that really can expand your life. So that's what the book is about.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing. And I guess what came to me, is it fair to say the inner critic voice is a rule-based voice? Is that, yeah? Okay,
yeah, that makes sense, right? And thank you for saying that. One of the things that happens that these fears of being inadequate, these fears about not being good enough, they don't pop up from one day to another day. In fact, in the book, there is one exercise when I invite people to look at the history of that particular inner critic voice. When they were kids, what did their mind told them when they make a mistake, when things went wrong, when they were teenagers, when they were young adults? Because what we see is that through our life, in some way or another, we have been organizing our actions around the inner critic. It happens that sometimes in our life, our inner critic gets louder and louder. And then I teach, of course, acceptance skills, right? So I think there, and also there is a couple of chapters on forgiveness and self-compassion. I think when we learn to be gentle with ourselves, and I teach that in the book, we actually give ourselves much more space to do other things that are important in our life. I have maybe 3 or 4 self-compassion exercises. And the chapter in forgiveness was a moving chapter for me to write about. And I hope the readers find it helpful. But I think we often, when people are prone to deeply care for the things they do, there is a lot of guilt and shame when things go wrong. There is a lot of feeling wrong, and people spend hours and hours criticizing themselves for things that they did years ago, hundreds of years ago. So I think forgiving ourselves as a personal choice to let go of the past and focusing what is in front of us is another micro skill that we have to practice. Otherwise, we're going to spend our lives all the time criticizing ourselves for things that we did before. So that was a moving chapter for me to write about.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds it. Okay, so That all sounds brilliant, and obviously I'll link to your book in the show notes.
Thank you.
So if people want to check it out, so obviously this is a podcast about OCD, and you primarily work with people with OCD. At least that's what I understand. Yeah. So how often do you see this overlap of people with OCD and also who are high achievers or perfectionists?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. In one of the studies that I read, and this is maybe from 10 years ago, what they were looking is that there is at least 30 to 40% of people who have OCD who also can be high achievers or engage in perfectionistic actions. Sometimes people get confused, right? With OCD, we have this intrusive, unwanted, and very, very yucky thought image that pops up, and there is a compulsion. But with perfectionism, what we have is this story about not being good enough, this strong fear of making mistakes. And sometimes I might tell you, this is just the way it is, which is different with obsessions. But we know that 30 to 40% of people with OCD are also engaging in perfectionistic actions. Now, this is a paper that I read, that was published maybe 10 years ago. I don't have the current stats. But if we think about the clients that we work with, we see that there is an overlap. Certainly, there is an overlap.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And so when the overlap does happen, does this perfectionistic or high achieving behaviors interfere with OCD treatment in any way?
That's a great question. The answer is yes. The answer is yes. I think sometimes we have seen people having meta obsessions about how the treatment is going, right? That's on the one level, like, is this the right treatment? Are you the right therapist? Is exposure going to work? So we have that. But also what we have is this strong fear that doesn't have a compulsion sometimes. It is fear about that I am not going to make it in life. I'm not going to have a fulfilling life. I'm not going to be in a relationship. So I see that, yes, it affects the treatment. But there is also this other conversation that happens about how there's this fear about not making it in life, basically. There's one time when I was working with a client hundreds of years ago. And my client in one of the sessions said something very powerful. My client was scared about being unlovable. What if no one loves me for who I am? And what if they know that I have OCD and I'm never going to be in a relationship or never going to be a parent? Those are deep fears. Those are really deep fears that are beyond dealing with OCD, the obsession, and the compulsion. And I'm definitely not minimizing the struggle of dealing with OCD, but this fear of being unlovable, this fear about not being good enough in a relationship, I don't think that's addressed with ERP, right? That requires other types of skills. So I have seen that coexisting in both of them in ways in which really tap into how our life as human beings and our relationships can be really scary for us.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That is a really deep-rooted belief and fear.
Yeah. And I'm sure you have seen that, right? Yeah. But ERP doesn't tackle this fear of being unlovable, or this fear of abandonment, or this fear of really not being good enough. Right? How many times my clients have asked me, okay, if I get a hold of the OCD, right, will I be able to be in a relationship? And that's one of the things that I think I have seen so much pain with these fears about not experiencing love, or these fears of messing up in the relationship. So I think that's when you can see sometimes these perfectionistic tendencies kicking in, and these extreme fears, these very intense fears about being unlovable, not being good enough. And what they do, they organize the behaviors in many ways. They want to have the perfect day. They want to be the perfect partner, right? Or sometimes they are going to avoid at all the dates and going to connect with people. So those are the fears that many times I have witnessed when there is this overlap of OCD, these perfectionistic tendencies.
Yeah, and I'm hesitating. I'm also going to throw it out there that OCD itself could be a way of coping, a way of dealing with this very core belief. I'm not saying that's fact. I'm just throwing that out there as a theory. But it's something that always resonates in my brain. Definitely in my own story. Sometimes OCD has felt more like a way of coping with stuff I didn't want to deal with in my own life, my own feelings and stuff. I can say that for me personally, but
if I can respond to that a little bit, I want to say I appreciate what you are saying, because I think, and this is, of course, I don't have the truth, so I'm saying this lively too, but I think sometimes we in science or in psychology, we're using frames to understand what's going on. And perhaps we try to box sometimes people the complexity of what we're dealing with. I think we know ERP works. I think there's no question about that. But we also know that many times it's just not enough, because there are other ways in which we have organized our action, other ways that we feel about ourselves that are perhaps in a larger schema, in a larger way. And I think, to your point, in some cases, it is possible that people have organized OCD as a way to protect themselves from this deep fear. There is no reason why we cannot hold that, right? I don't think we're invalidating science at all, but I think we are just perhaps opening up to the idea that psychological models are just models. They don't have the truth to understand all the layers of who we are and our history. And I hope that we can be open to that.
Yeah, that's very much, as a therapist, that's how I try to position myself. Until there's a hard, solid evidence that proves it's one way, we need to hold many theories in mind, you know. But yeah, thank you for responding and sharing to that. I think that's why I'm passionate about being an integrative psychotherapist. So I just bring in as many as I can, you know. ERP, with every single client that has OCD, I use ERP without fail, because it's brilliant. But it's also not a magic bullet. For me, there's a few of my clients are just use ERP and they just make incredible progress. And some, there's much more skills that are needed, like ACT or even compassion focused therapy I'll bring in, and other stuff too. But those are the other two core ones I bring in. So yeah, I'm a big advocate of emerging, which is why the podcast tries to cover many different therapies, even ones I don't use as a therapist myself. Because it doesn't mean they don't work just because I don't use them.
Which I do appreciate. I think, again, we know that ERP works, but no psychological model is going to be a magic bullet. Humans were very, very complex. And I think what we honor in our work, or I think what I hope we can do, is to honor the complexity of each person's story. And reality is that when I think about OCD and when I think about ERP, one of the largest struggles I encounter with my clients is this deep hope for connection, this deep hope for love. I couldn't address with ERP. ERP doesn't address that, period. Or how we connect, how we find intimacy. How do we know when people love us? How do I let another person that I love them? Right? So those are things that are part of our who we are in the world. And to your point, I think many times our work requires that we need to expand our minds using different models, different ways of connecting with people and just helping them to have richer lives. And one model perhaps doesn't do that.
No, exactly. Very much so. And obviously we both work with teens or adolescents. And a big part of that is like identity. Who am I? You know, that they're very much trying to figure that out. And I think ACT and values is very useful there to try and help guide them. So that's
true. That's true. If I can say something that's something to say that when we ask values to a person in his mid-30s, or we try to do some values exploration, it's one thing. But when you're working with teenagers and they are 14, 15 years old, and we ask them what do you want your life to be about, it's a big question, right? It's a big question, right? And what they stand up for. And you get all types of responses. But I think even the model requires that we're flexible to understand developmental processes in a person, right? The response of a 30-year-old person is going to be different with a teen, right? Sometimes, you're going to get the shoulders lifting up, right? Like, I don't know, right? So we have to find different ways to explore what matters to them through music, sometimes to movies, right? But there is something to honor again where a person is and understanding developmentally where they are too that requires flexibility.
Yeah, spot on, absolutely. And sometimes teens are like, what are values?
Exactly, what's that?
And I'm like, yeah, what are they? Well, mine are these. So yeah.
I love it. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess thank you so much for talking on this topic. I think it will resonate with a lot of the listeners. And even before we started talking about OCD, I think a lot of the skills you're talking about, the way you view perfectionism and striving behaviors, if you just change those words to OCD, everything you said is still applied, at least from memory. So
I think so.
Yeah,
I will agree with that.
Okay, good. So lastly, is there anything else you wish you could have said or shared today?
Yes. There is just one addition. A big micro skill that I like to teach my clients that are prone to high achieving behaviors is to check whether if they are maximizers or satisficers. A maximizer is trying to make the best decision all the time, right? Like if they have to buy a coffee machine, if they have to record something, they want to make sure that they have all the information. They're spending a lot of time researching. They want to, again, make the best decision. A satisficer will make a decision that is good enough in the moment and is willing to sit with uncertainty, not knowing how things are going to be, but moving on with their life. So I think in the case of perfectionistic actions, there is a lot of chronic indecisiveness. People get stuck making decisions. And it's because many times they're trying to maximize it, right? So another micro skill that I like to teach is distinguishing, okay, when do we maximize? When do we go into satisfying decision-making processes?
Yeah, okay. I like that. I think the thing that comes to my mind is I'm definitely a satisfizer. Am I saying that right? Yeah.
Yes. You got
it. Can you ever go too far into satisfying? Because I guess sometimes I make choices that I'm like, I really should have thought this out more. Because I'm so like, I don't care. I just want to buy it or do it, or I don't need to think about this. Who cares if it's not the perfect thing? But sometimes I'm like, oh man, I really should have thought about this.
That's a great question. I would say that as with anything, we can overdo it sometimes, as anything, right? The reason why I have the chapter is because hundreds of years ago, when I was a grad student, I decided to buy a coffee machine. And I look at my budget, right? I had a specific amount of money to invest in the coffee machine. We're looking at a coffee machine. This is now thinking about who I'm going to marry. But I was like 3 months researching for the best coffee machine within that budget, right? Looking online, asking people, go to try coffee machines. So I was totally into maximizing mode, right? So it's really, we can overdo both things, right? But I think if we distinguish, okay, for this, I want to maximize my decision. And for these other things, I want to just make a satisfying decision so I can move on with my life, makes a difference.
Yeah, really, really good point. I like that framework. Maybe I just need to maximize occasionally. Maybe that's my problem that I'm
from time to time, maybe
I satisfy with my wife. She'll do, that I don't need to think about. I'm joking.
I love it.
I definitely maximize with that decision, and that's why I had a lot of anxiety. Anyway,
cool.
Thank you so much for your time, your book, and just sharing your expertise on this.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's always a treat to chat with you, Stu. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. If you enjoy the OCD Stories podcast and would like to support us with a one-time tip/donation, please go to theocdstories.com/support. All tips, no matter how large or small, are greatly appreciated. Please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to the podcast. And thank you to NoCD for supporting our work. If you want to find out more about NoCD, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories or click the link in the episode description. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. And until we speak, take care.